Let's travel back in time to the heartland of America, when St. Louis was on the rise. But beneath its shimmering face lurked a dark secret, a stain on the nation. You see, in the 1950s, St. Louis set out on a grand experiment of urban housing, an ambitious project to resolve their never-ending housing crisis. The solution? The Pruitt-Igoe housing estate. Although initially, at least, this solution was a beacon of hope, it swiftly became a haunting symbol of failure. So join us as we discover the rise and fall of St. Louis's worst housing project. St. Louis was a vital railroad and river terminus, a center for developing automotive traffic, and a site for the first Olympic Games held in the country. Although the city suffered with the rest of the nation through the Great Depression, by the 1950s, it was still growing at the same rate. The 1949 Housing Act gave cities like St. Louis a chance to expand access to affordable housing across the city. Federal assistance funding was secured by identifying areas of high density and low wages, growing populations with less access to new homes, or simply identifying neighborhoods as slums. Mayors Joseph Durst and later Raymond Tucker wanted to remove these slum districts and replace them with apartments for more affluent and socially valued residents. To mayors and politicians like Durst and Tucker, St. Louis, as well as many other cities across America, particularly in the South and Midwest, had a problem: white flight. This continuous migration northwards of African Americans from the inhumane treatment of segregation of the South caused many white Americans to go west and further north themselves, taking their tax dollars along with them. Anyhow, this depopulation and social exodus was reacted to about as well as you'd expect from most white Americans and regional governments. It's important to note that sites like Pruitt-Igoe were the rule, not the exception, so let's have a look at how it came to be. The two lead architects of the eventual housing complex were George Helmuth and Minoru Yamasaki. Yamasaki, a Japanese-American architect and engineer, had a special sensitivity to the constant racial discrimination of his time. He rose to fame by combining modernism and humanism in his architecture for the good of functionalism and the individual human experience. But with Pruitt-Igoe as his first leading project, that type of fame honestly could not have been predicted. George Francis Helmuth, on the other hand, was much more traditional. These two men, bound by nothing more than a common project, would make one of the biggest housing complexes in the city. How they went about it would decide how generations of St. Louis citizens lived. And with that context, let's go ahead and take a tour of the former Pruitt-Igoe complex. The project was two different facilities meant for two distinct classes of people. The Pruitt half was named after Wendell Oliver Pruitt, a local man who flew P-47 Jugs and P-51 Mustangs during World War II. The other half was named for Missouri Congressman William L. Igoe, who served over 6 years as a representative in Washington, D.C. Each of these men was a decent namesake for the housing project. Still, they immediately acknowledged through the very naming of this facility that it was destined for segregation by race, with Igoe being a third of the buildings and intended for white residents only. Nevertheless, the complex was designed to provide all tenants with sun, space, and greenery. A variety of 33 and 11-story apartment blocks were spread out to provide natural sunlight, parks and green spaces, as well as a natural flow of traffic through the neighborhood and city. This was imagined to be a place where children and families could relax, play freely, without concerns about crime or traffic. 12,000 tenants were meant to call the 57-acre project home, and there were some unrealized aspects of the plan that would have made this neighborhood truly special. For example, they did away with the traditional divides in more isolated apartments and high-rises that would allow for neighbors to interact quickly and regularly via large galleries on the third floor. Unfortunately, a lack of funding from investors or the city forced Yamasaki to revise the design for cost cutting. What's worse, while it was still under construction, the Supreme Court handed down its verdict on Brown versus the Board of Education, declaring segregation by separate but equal means as the rule of the land. In practice, this forced the Igoe neighborhood to be African American, and the combined project's residents would at first be about 98% African American. Bureaucracy and court rulings forced Yamasaki to change his vision completely. The project was no longer a clear message of equality despite class and race. Rather, it was enforcement of segregation. In 1957, the facility's occupancy rate was an incredible 91%, but by the following year, it dropped noticeably, as all those who could move to better homes did. Now, this had several factors we'll cover, but while land clearance for large-capacity high-rises, new and affordable suburban neighborhoods, and federal highway programs had temporarily created a boom in the city's demand for housing, by the start of the 1960s, the demand naturally tapered off because of migration out of the town and into cheaper family homes. So solutions like Pruitt-Igoe apartments just weren't necessary anymore. Federal law required the housing authority to fund maintenance and general repairs through rent collected from the local tenants. As occupancy fell, so did the regularity and quality of maintenance. Maintenance shortfalls encouraged vandalism, eventually spiraling into violent crime on the open gallery floors and public spaces around the buildings. In 1965, federally approved aid reached the complex for repairs, upgrades, and a general rejuvenation of the space. This was the first of several similar efforts, but they could have been more effective at stopping the hemorrhaging of people and finances. In 1969, the remaining tenants went on a 9-month rent strike. To show their frustration, this was the final straw for the project. The city began to investigate these means of demolition, moving all the tower's residents into just 11 of the 33 blocks. The city began methodically erasing the buildings. This process continued all the way up to 1976, at which point the estate had vanished from St. Louis's horizon. The end of the Pruitt-Igoe apartments would be an iconic image for architects and urban planners for decades. The myth as it was became that the tenants became the downfall of the apartment buildings, citing that there was an incompatibility between the high-rise structure and the large poor families who came to inhabit it, only a generation removed from the farm. From the beginning, it was easy to blame the architecture and the people rather than the system and the broader circumstances that the city created and was subject to. However, while the architects attempted to approach it humanely, the aforementioned greater circumstances and budget cuts killed their romantic version of the program. The building's slick exteriors, solid steel and concrete construction, and skipping elevators represented the city's modernity. Inside, and at its very conception, it was a tool to beautify and redevelop the city's image, cleaning out the slums not just for the good of the people living there, but because it made the city and government look bad, rather than addressing the real problems, just kind of sweeping the mess under the rug and pretending that everything is normal. All that's left today is an urban, empty forest slowly being filled in by new homes and businesses. I'd love to know what you all think. Maybe we can reach a conclusion by further discussing this in the comment section below. I do hope you'll consider subscribing and clicking that join button to support the channel. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.